So we have a webinar series where we are showcasing the talents of academics globally, across the UK and globally, who have demonstrated real innovation in their teaching strategies, so the teaching and learning strategies, where they have adopted some type of digital resource or digitally enhancing their offering for their teaching and their learning. And so we are hosting this webinar series to really showcase these talented academics. And some of these academics will also have papers and published papers on these little projects. And if you're interested in the TI awards at all, or the academic educational research that we support and also help to run, please do go and visit our website so that you can have a look at more information about those, and see if you want to get involved, if you want to feel like you get inspired and you want to submit for an award for next year, please have a look. But similarly, if you're interested in some of the, if you've been inspired by some of the discussions about how you can utilize and harness some of your innovations, sometimes we often think that we're not being innovative, but actually we might be being innovative, and think about applying for awards, then please do so and come and talk to us. I will waffle on because that's usually what I do, but I don't want to speak too much because I'm really excited to hand over to Christine. So Christine, I know Christine. So Christine's from Warwick. So I've had the pleasure of working with Christine for many years. Christine is one of the smartest people I know, and she's an incredibly talented teaching-focused academic. And so watch this space. And so Christine has to teach one of the more challenging subjects that we get to teach in biosciences, which is the quantitative side of things. And not just that, but also large scale. A lot of the innovations that we tend to see and those that just get a lot of acclaim are those that are targeting small group teaching. And there's usually lots of things that people can innovate with and do that's new with particularly small group teaching or smaller cohorts. But when it comes to really upscaling to large cohorts, that's a whole new game. And so I'm really excited to invite Christine to present her project. So we'll have a good half an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions. We are recording the session, and so if you're happy to have your face on the recording, please have your camera on. And if you would like to ask a question, you can ask a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we'll come to you at the end of the talk, and then you can ask Christine some questions at the end. So yeah, have a think of some great questions. And so that's it from me. And so I'll hand over to Christine, who will go through her presentation. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Leanne. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine. I am a teaching-focused assistant professor at the University of Warwick, and I'm going to talk about some of the changes we made to the way that we deliver quantitative skills training for our Year 1 undergraduates. So for a little bit of context, the University of Warwick is a Russell Group University in the West Midlands in the UK, and I am based within the School of Life Sciences. We recruit around about 400 undergraduate students every year, and we're actually looking to increase that a little bit over the next couple of years. So we're talking about big numbers of students. We recruit into 4 different degree schemes. So we have biological sciences, biomedical sciences, biochemistry, and neuroscience. Across all 4 of those degree schemes, we have a few core modules that everyone has to take. And one of those was quantitative skills in biology. This was a core Year 1 module. It contained 14 workshops, and because I can never resist an opportunity to point it out, those workshops are quadruple taught because our teaching space, our largest available teaching space that had computers in which the students can work, holds around about 100 students at a time. So we were teaching this in 4 sessions per week. And that module also contained 2 assessments that the students would sit to get an idea of what they were taking away from the module. The module was taught in a mix of Excel and IBM's SPSS statistics package, which we use for some of the more advanced statistical analysis that Excel doesn't support very readily. And we had various challenges and continue to have various challenges getting students up to speed with these programs, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. The challenges that we had in this module, and I want to start by saying this there was a lot that was very good about this module. There was a lot that worked really well, but there were some things that we really struggled with. One of those was attendance. So this is a graph just of me taking a head count of students in workshops. And so you can see in the particular year that I gathered this data, which workshops I was teaching, as opposed to colleagues covering other workshops. With 400 students being taught on Thursday and on Friday, we expect around about 200 students coming in per day. In the first few weeks, the attendance drops to a little over 50%, and by the end of the module, we're somewhere down around 25% attendance in the workshops. The pass rate was not fantastic. About 8% of students failed the module. So the last year that this module ran before we made any changes, 31 students failed it. This module is core, which is to say that all of our students have to take it, but it isn't required for progression into year 2. So if a student fails the module, they choose whether or not they want to resit it. And in the last year that this ran, 12 of those 31 students chose to resit the module, and the remaining students chose not to do so. When students choose to resit the module, the pass rate is okay. What I take from these numbers is, if students understand that having a solid grasp of quantitative skills and data analysis is going to prepare them for success in year 2 and year 3, then I would expect students would choose to take that resit and review the content, revise the content, resit the module and get a passing mark, so that for their own confidence and security that they know they are set up for success in year 2. So to me, a large proportion of students choosing not to take a resit worries me that they're not really seeing the significance of the content for their future studies. And in first year modules, where we are very skills based, where we are thinking about setting up for future learning, that rings alarm bells for me. So that was something that I was quite concerned about. The assessments were marked by graduate teaching assistants, GTAs, split across maybe 20 GTAs at a time for the size of the cohort. We're paying them the time it takes for them to do that marking, which is an expense for the department, and it's also very time consuming. Our GTAs obviously are PhD students. The priority on their time is completing their PhD, and GTA work is something they do on the side. They don't have infinite time available for working as a GTA. So having a large chunk of time being dedicated to marking rather than doing something more interesting and more active was something that I wanted to see if we could do anything about. We also had some challenges with inconsistency between the markers, even with a good solid mark scheme. GTAs that have been doing this marking for a couple of years are much more comfortable with it. New GTAs come in and have a harder time. So we would have every year some students questioning their marks, and that meant that myself or my colleague who were the academics leading this module would be remarking that work. And that again is a cost of both time and salary in getting that marking done. We also had some issues with feedback. For a while, we had the GTAs write feedback on the submissions, and then that became quite inconsistent because some GTAs are more verbose than others. So we tried giving the GTAs a drop-down list of feedback statements that they could make, but those are necessarily quite vague. Feedback like graphs are okay, or some issues with graphs, which doesn't really tell the student what the problem is, and they can't then really do much with that feedback. Also, as is quite standard, feedback takes a long time to get back to students. They submit the work, we have some time to do the marking, and then we release the marks and feedback about 4 weeks after they submitted it, by which time a lot of them have moved on to other things. You know, if nothing else, they've moved on to revising for exams. So they're not really engaging with that feedback in a constructive way. We also heard some bits and pieces of concerning feedback from colleagues who are teaching on other modules and are finding that students aren't retaining the information that we're teaching them, or they're not able to apply what they've been taught in other contexts. So while if you remind them, in that workshop you learned about t-tests, go and look at your notes on t-tests, then they can recall what they learned about t-tests. But if in another setting you present them with data that could sensibly be analysed with a t-test, they struggle to make that connection and they don't know what to do with the data. So that was the situation that we were in with quant skills delivery a couple of years ago. And this happened to coincide with a restructuring within the university of how we apply credits to modules, or the sizes of modules and the CAT values of modules. Because we were restructuring that credit framework, this required some of our modules to move around or merge with other modules. And in particular, the quantitative skills module was merged with this other module called laboratories and assessed work. Now that was an existing module that consisted of year one labs and also our tutorials program, in which students complete some written work and some presentations. So that was already quite a big module containing two quite distinct sort of spheres of learning. And we were adding in quant skills as a third sort of moving part into one big module. So this module that already existed, labs and assessed work, it contained 12 practical labs that students would come in and do. They would write up 5 lab reports based on some of those labs sort of spread out throughout the year. Those lab reports did not require very much data analysis specifically. It was mostly more sort of description of what they observed and interpretation of what it meant, but there wasn't a lot of statistics taking place. The labs also contained and had recently introduced in-lab skills assessment. My colleague Beatrice came up with these. And what this is for every 16 students, we have 1 GTA. That's a much stronger ratio than we would usually have in teaching labs. But that GTA's role is to assess the student's use of particular skills. So as an example of this, we might be assessing centrifuge use. The GTA comes around one at a time to their 16 allocated students and asks them to demonstrate how to use a centrifuge. And if the student can load up 2 equally weighted Eppendorf tubes balanced across the rotor, into the rotor, put the lid on, spin the centrifuge up, stay with the centrifuge until it reaches speed, don't wander off and do something else. And then once your spinning has finished, you can retrieve your samples. If the student can do all of those steps, then the GTA can sign off that they can safely use a centrifuge. This had been brought in partly to get a better understanding of what skills the students were developing and what skills the students were struggling with and where we needed to focus our teaching, and also partly to boost attendance. What we were seeing before Beatrice brought these skills assessments in was attendance sort of dropping off in term 2. And by bringing in these assessments, although they're not worth a great many cats, but they are worth a little bit, and that's enough incentive to get the students to be coming in. So we got together, myself and the conveners of the existing labs and tutorials module, put our heads together and tried to figure out what it was we really wanted to achieve with this new module that was going to bring everything together. And we ended up with quite a laundry list. I wanted to link the workshops to the labs to contextualize what I was teaching them and give them more reason to engage with it and be invested in it and retain what they're being taught, rather than teaching them about t-tests in a sterile t-test learning zone and then hope that they might understand how to apply that to real data in future. Train them on real data so that they can see that it's part of what they're doing in the lab. We wanted to retain those in-lab skills assessments because we were seeing that it was improving attendance and also engagement in the labs. And I wanted to yoink them and put them into my workshops as well, because they seem to be working wonders in the labs. So we wanted to see what they would do in the workshops. So develop a similar set of skills assessments that we could put into that kind of dry environment. We knew that we needed to bring down the overall credit value from 36 to 30 cats, and that was going to mean we had to have less content overall. We can't teach the same amount of stuff and give the students less credit for it. We can't ask the students to put in the same amount of time and give them less credit for it. At the same time, we wanted to retain as much academic as value as we possibly could. So it was a real balancing act in terms of what we could take out and what really needed to stay and what we could sort of condense down and save ourselves maybe teaching the same thing multiple times. So we made a few changes that I'm hoping I can map out in a sensible way, but a lot of the changes we've made kind of link in together. So in order to explain one change, I kind of have to give you a bit more context on some other changes we made. But to start with, we reduced down the number of workshops. We started with 14, we had to bring that down to 10, and then we redesigned what we were delivering and how we were delivering it. We had to lose some material. We lost some of our more advanced material. For instance, we had a couple of workshops looking at deterministic modeling, differential equations. We were framing it around SIR models of infection spread within a population. On a personal level, this hurt a little bit, I've got to say. I enjoyed teaching this. I think this is really fun stuff. And this is stuff that we were delivering right at the end of the module when our attendance was low. So we were dealing with the 25% most engaged, most enthusiastic students, and they were enjoying this stuff. But the 75% that weren't there weren't getting anything out of it. It didn't tie into what they were doing in labs. We can't have them gathering infection data in a year one lab. So it was difficult to contextualize in that setting. And ultimately, we agreed that the sensible place for this to be taught was in a more tailored module. We have an immunology module, it can go into there, or an epidemiology module. It can go into those places rather than keeping it in this big sort of foundational year one module. At the same time, we were able to introduce a bit of new content, and that was very exciting. My rule here was if it ties in with the labs they're going to do, then we can try and find a place for it. And if it sits outside of labs, it probably sits outside of this module. So we were able to bring in, for example, a workshop looking at how you would use Fiji to analyze microscopy images. And this tied in a bit with the microscopy that they were doing in their labs. One reason I was really excited to bring in Fiji is none of the students have used it before. I've said that most of this module we teach in either Excel or SPSS. Some of them come in with years of experience with Excel, and they know everything they're going to do in Excel and all the shortcuts and everything, and they just crack on with it. Some of them have never seen Excel in their lives. And this is becoming more and more common over time. More of our students do not have access to a personal laptop or desktop. They're doing everything on their phones or on a tablet. Excel doesn't work, I think, particularly well on a phone or a tablet. It's not something that they're just sort of casually encountering, whereas they might have done 10 or 20 years ago. The syllabus in school has also changed, so there's less emphasis on Microsoft Office in sort of year 9, year 10, year 11. So year on year, we're seeing fewer students with an existing knowledge of Excel. And that gap is widening because at the same time, we are still getting some students that know exactly what they're doing in Excel. So being able to bring in a piece of software that none of them have seen before, and they're all starting absolutely from scratch, leveling that playing field was something that was quite important to me. I think it reassures the students, you're not bad at this because you're bad at this. You're struggling with Excel because you haven't seen it before. That guy over there has years of experience with Excel. That doesn't make him smarter than you. And you can tell them that, but it's hard for them to internalize. But if you sit them all down with Fiji and they're all brand new, they get to see that actually, oh no, we're all brand new and this is how we all work when we're doing something new. And that I think is quite empowering. So I was really pleased that we were able to bring this in while also having to strip out some content. The earlier workshops, we refocused around some foundations. The module that I'm building from was first conceived about 10 years previously by my colleague Dan Franklin. And at the time that he was establishing the syllabus for this module, Excel was something that we could reasonably expect students to come in with familiarity with. And so the structure of the workshop started from some knowledge of Excel. We've needed to refocus that so that we start with absolutely no knowledge of Excel. Every year I get more and more students, when I give them a spreadsheet in Excel to open up and do some calculations, they reach for their phone because they think they're going to do the calculation on the calculator app in their phone and type the answer into cell C1 that I've told them to do it in. They don't realize that Excel is anything other than a grid. So our earlier workshops had to start with that level of, this is what Excel does, this is how it works. This is what Excel thinks BODMAS is. Sometimes it can figure out where the brackets should be. Other times you need to tell it where the brackets should be. So we have a couple of workshops now that cover that level of functionality, and it seems sensible to frame that around what we call lab maths. So figuring out concentrations, dilution factors, those kinds of things. I have recently run a survey, in fact, it's still open, so this is preliminary data from my survey, but asking students about their perceptions of some of the changes that we've made. And so here's my first bit of results. I asked whether they agreed with the statement, my previous maths education prepared me for the workshops. And you can see students that are currently in third year, so they did the previous iteration of this module before we made the change. Were pretty evenly split about whether they were really prepared to do the maths they needed to do. By making the changes that we've made, refocusing on those foundations rather than, so we've given them a sort of a gentler learning curve to work through. And they are now much more confident that they are prepared to tackle that work, which is lovely to see. We also reframed the content of what we were teaching, so it would specifically refer where we could to the data that they were gathering in the lab. Now, there are pros and cons to this. This wasn't a brand new idea. This was something that previously we'd chosen not to do, because if you ask a student to practice running a t-test and you give them some really exciting backstory about some really cool CRISPR thing, sometimes they get bogged down on the CRISPR thing. Sometimes they go off on a Wikipedia rabbit hole when they want to think about the biology, because ultimately these are biology students and that's what excites them. If you give them the same, mathematically the same question, but instead it's about pig farming, they don't go off on that rabbit hole. They just run the t-test. And sometimes you need them to run the t-test. So there's pros and cons to giving them a bit more interesting context to the skills you're teaching them. What I'm seeing is that they're picking it up a little more slowly because they are going off on their Wikipedia rabbit holes. But once they pick it up, it's sticking better because they understand how it applies to something they think is interesting, rather than it being a tool that they have picked up, kind of. So that's where we're at with this at the moment, and it's an interesting kind of puzzle, I think. The last change we made to the workshops was reallocating the teaching across a broader group of academics. Previously, this module had been taught entirely by myself and my colleague Dan Franklin. And a consequence of that was that the student perception was that myself and Dan were weird little stats nerds that existed in a wider biology department where most biologists didn't do statistics because they were proper biologists. And that's not the case, but it's an easy perception for students to pick up. So something I really wanted to make sure of here was that the stats was being taught by as many different academics as possible, because we all can do the stats because we're all scientists. So framing it to students as a toolkit that is relevant to all of biosciences was really important. It did have the added bonus of slightly reducing my workload, which I'm not too upset about. Those are the changes we made to the workshops. We also had to make some changes to the labs. We had 12 of those. We had to bring those down to 10, and we also redesigned some of them. So the first thing we tried to do was figure out where we could have students in labs gathering data that could be analysed in workshops. I have just a little example here that I found very pleasing when we found it. So this is a little excerpt from an existing workshop. It's looking at drug elimination kinetics, and it's looking at the elimination of this antibiotic, which happens to follow first order kinetics. And what we show the students is the data is a curve. In order to plot the actual curved line, you log the y-axis, which gives you a straight line. You take the gradient of that straight line, you plug it into the equation for the curve, and boom, you get a lovely curve. And we taught them how to do that in the workshops. Once we started figuring out how the workshops and the labs could interlink, we discovered one of the labs was doing this. They were growing bacteria, which grows along a curve, and then they were teaching the students to take a log of the y-axis, find the gradient of that line, plug the gradient into the equation for the curve, and boom, you get a curve model. This is the same maths, but the students were not seeing that it was the same maths. It was being taught in two different settings, in two different contexts, and the curve goes the other way around, so it's not immediately obvious. None of that's the student's fault. I didn't know that the lab was running that was doing this transformation. The lab didn't know that I had a workshop doing this transformation. So it hadn't occurred to either of us to go, hey, this will be useful later. So the extremely simple intervention of me in my workshop saying, Kevin's going to do this with you next week in the lab. And at the same time, Kevin in the lab going, hey, Christine did this with you a week ago in the workshops. That alone had a massive impact on student retention of what they were doing. And what my colleague Kevin Purdy observed in the lab was that once we started just explicitly pointing out this relationship to the students, he saw far more students actually getting to grips with the maths in the lab. What previously would happen is the students would come in, they'd grow the bacteria, take the measurements, and then they would go home to, quote, finish off the maths later. And we all know they often don't finish off the maths later. What they really mean is, it's been a long day, I'm tired, and I don't really want to talk about logarithms right now. But once we pointed out that they had actually already done this math, they learnt this math last week, it is not impossible for them. And if you do it now, then it will be done, and then you can go and have a lovely weekend and not worry about logarithms. Then they became much more willing to have a go at doing the maths in the lab rather than going away to do it behind closed doors. And therefore they're asking more questions and they're learning more and they're getting more out of the lab. as well as getting more out of the workshop because they've now seen how they apply what they learned to the workshop. They're making better use of their time in the lab as well. So that was really exciting, and probably the easiest change that we made was literally just signposting to each other's existing teaching. So that was fantastic. We've asked lab leads to incorporate lab maths and calculations into their manuals where they can. And this is not going to be a very quick, immediate change. Lab manuals take time to produce, they take time to proofread, and they take time to change. So I'm considering this to be an ongoing process. As part of my survey, I asked students whether they think what they're learning in workshops is helping them in the lab itself. And what you can see is last year's results were very similar to the year before's. But this year, there seems to be a bit of a changing tide, and the students maybe are more inclined to agree that the workshops help them to complete the lab. This is not a significant result, and I forced myself to put a very disappointing p-value on my slides, but I'll be here and I'll be honest. But I think that this is something hopefully that we can build on over time as those manuals get adjusted and tweaked and polished and perfected. We thought a bit about timetabling, about whether they should do the lab and then the workshop. So here is some data, go and see how to analyze it. Or should we do the workshop and then the lab? This is how you analyze this kind of data. Now you know what shape your curve should be, go and gather one. And we've settled on the second option, I think. It helps them to know before they go into the lab what it is that they're meant to be acquiring. And then if their graph is all over the place, they can see that it's all over the place and ask why. Because it's not super helpful for them to go away and start writing up a lab report and then go, oh, that's not a Michaelis-Menten curve. Much better to notice that at the time and then have another go at your experiment. Something we're sort of playing with at the moment is having students sharing data amongst themselves. So with this growth curve lab that we have them doing, they grow 2 different species of bacteria and they calculate a doubling time for the 2 different species. We have the students contribute those numbers into a cohort database, which is a very grand name for a Moodle quiz. And then I publish that as a spreadsheet the following week. And we ask them to investigate whether the 2 species of bacteria have significantly different doubling times. What we find when we ask them to do this is that the really switched on students start to get a bit suspicious. And they start to ask questions, and we want them to ask questions, and we want them to ask them in a public place, which they do on the Moodle forums. They want to know whether this is a sensible way to determine this. They want to know whether these are biological repeats or technical repeats, and whether the differences between the numbers has anything to do with the bacterial species, or is it just that we're a bunch of freshers and we're gathering quite varied data. And those are really important discussions to have. And I don't think it's a very effective discussion for me to stand at the front of a workshop and introduce concepts like biological and technical repeats. They seem to engage with it much better if it's me answering a question rather than me delivering information that I think that they should know. So setting up a situation like this that encourages them to ask those questions and then have a discussion about it in the Moodle forum has been really effective. So that's been very exciting, as much as it is quite daunting. Because it feels a little bit like being challenged, but it's important to be challenged sometimes. Okay, the next change we made then was requiring data analysis as part of our lab reports. So we now include this explicitly in the marking rubric, and therefore students are pretty sure now that what they learn in workshops is helpful when they complete lab reports, because I've explicitly told them that it will be, and they have agreed with me, so that's nice. We also encourage students to analyze their own data wherever they can. We have model data that we can provide students if they need it, if they've been off sick and their lab partner has also been off sick, then yes, we can provide model data. But we don't provide model data because their data is bad. Because what we are not assessing is quality of data, we are assessing quality of data analysis. And it is perfectly possible to do good analysis on rubbish data. Usually your conclusion is, this is rubbish data. And if you can lead me to conclude and agree with you through the writing of your lab report, then you have done your job. Also, by requiring them to write up their own rubbish data, which I will agree is harder than writing up nice data, it incentivizes them to gather nice data, to stay longer in the lab and have another go if their Michaelis-Menten curve is more of a frowny face. Try again and get a nice curve. You know what shape it should be, and you know that you're going to have to write this up. So just give it another go. It'll take you half an hour, but then you'll have decent data. And that's that's really where the learning happens. You don't learn by doing a thing once and going, oh, guess I'm bad at that. I should just move on with my life being bad at a thing. You learn by trying a second, third, fourth time. And this is incentivizing them to have another go, which is really great. One thing that I was really clear on when we were talking about bringing data analysis into the lab reports is I want the students to decide what analysis to do. If we tell them, here's 2 columns full of numbers, run a t-test, they will run a t-test. And there's no skill in running a t-test in SPSS. It's a drop-down menu and a button. They can all do it. The skill in data analysis is knowing what your question is and what analysis to do to answer the question fairly. So the guidance we give in lab reports is a little bit intentionally vague. So for instance, where they've got these growth curves and doubling times, and they're comparing the 2 different species, we say, investigate whether there is a significant difference in doubling times. We don't mention t-tests, we don't mention Mann-Whitney-U, but they have in the previous 3 weeks had workshops on t-tests and Mann-Whitney-U and normality testing and how to decide whether you should run a parametric or a non-parametric test. So all the teaching is there, and we want them to apply that to the lab report that they are doing, rather than just add another thing to a checklist of things that they need to be doing. And that's gone okay. That's been a little bit of a tough adjustment, trying to explain to students sometimes after the fact that it's not that I didn't tell you what to do because I want you to fail. It's because I want to give you the space to figure things out and solve problems, and that is the task. But that has overall, I think, gone down quite well, although maybe slightly controversial in some spheres. Let's say that. We were able to incorporate skills assessments into workshops. These are the assessments that Bea was running in the labs. And this achieved 2 things. The first was a pretty substantial change in attendance. So this is the graph that I showed you earlier of attendance in the sort of previous iteration of the module, just me keeping a head count when I happen to be teaching in a workshop. And this is attendance that was captured for 4 workshops after we brought in the skills assessment. And you can see that attendance stays where it should be at close to 100%. They're coming in, they're doing the workshops because we are assessing skills in the workshops, and they want to get the points for sitting those assessments. But the thing is, once they're in the room with you, because they've come in order to do an assessment, they've not really got anything better to do than listen to you talk. And if you're going to talk about t-tests, then they're going to learn about t-tests. So that's been quite nice. The other thing it did is it seems to have improved student confidence. And this is a slightly tricky one because I don't have any data from before we brought in skills assessments, because I don't know how to formulate that question. So I've just asked the students who have experienced skills assessments whether they felt it helped them to build their confidence in what they were doing. And mostly they think, yes, it has been a helpful activity to do, which was the goal. Something I think can be quite tricky, particularly with data analysis, is teaching them a bunch of stuff and then examining them at the end. I would often get students saying they've got no idea how they're doing, and they don't know if they're building on a solid foundation or if they're building on a shaky foundation, everything's going to kind of collapse under them by the end of the module. So having something every week where we just come in and check, can you state hypotheses for this t-test? Can you explain why you would use a chi-square rather than an ANOVA? And just reassure them, and reassure myself, actually, that they are picking stuff up and they are learning from what they're doing. Sort of paces out the module a little nicer rather than dumping everything into an assessment at the end. Okay, this is the bit that I really intended to talk about, but then I got excited about all the other stuff, is the Smart Worksheet that we brought in, which we developed with LearnSci to replace the assessments that we previously had. So the Smart Worksheet is hosted within Moodle. It's familiar to students. They know what they're doing. They've used other Smart Worksheets as teaching aids during the course of the year. So they're familiar with the structure and what they need to do. Students have 6 weeks to complete the Smart Worksheet, which is made up of 3 problems. They can use their notes. They can use Google. They can work together with their peers. The worksheet allocates different data sets to different students. So we hope that peer support means that they are figuring out together how to solve a problem rather than just copying the answers, because it's fairly difficult to just copy the answers because you don't have the same data as your mates. So we're hoping that that is a constructive use of their time. There we go. The problems within this worksheet are based on the problems from our previous assessments. So they'll download data files and work through them in either Excel or SPSS, and they'll work their way towards solutions. The worksheet takes them through those problems in a kind of step-by-step way, whereas the previous assessments would have been more sandboxy. So previously we would have given them a data set and asked them quite a broad question, whereas now we will take them through a step at a time how to analyze that data. So I'm hoping my animation will work. Yes, lovely. So just to show as an example a bit of one of the problems. So they complete this table. So they're looking at the number of cases of influenza of a particular GP surgery and how many surgeries reported that number of cases. So they'll fill in, this is a whole table that I've cropped the middle out of. But that then allows them to calculate the mean number of cases seen per GP, which they enter here. Then they think about what kind of distribution would describe the data. And then they will start filling out a chi-square table down here. It's all the same steps that they should have been doing previously, but it is much more explicit in how to go about tackling the problem. And again, there's pros and cons to that, because if you were confronted with data that you need to do chi-square on, you wouldn't be taken through it step by step by someone telling you how to do it. But at the same time, these are first-year students, and they are here to learn as well as to be assessed. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they're given a bit more structure and taken through how to complete this work. So some outcomes of the changes that we have made. Students really like the Smart Worksheet very much. So the worksheet is self-marking, and it marks as they go, and it shows them their marks in real time. Students are very happy that they know where their grade came from. Students already were quite happy, but they're now significantly more sure that they understand where their grade came from. Because it's we're not paying PhD students, GTAs, to mark assessments, which means that the time that we were going to be paying them to do that, we can instead be doing the in-workshop skills assessments that requires a tighter ratio than we would otherwise have had. It also means that I don't have to do any remarking, because there's never any question about what the marks are, because it's an entirely objective process. The worksheet also gives real-time feedback on mistakes, and that's where we've seen a really substantial change in student responses. There's a very significant improvement in students thinking that the feedback helped them to improve. The feedback it's right there, it happens at the time, and it's specific to what's gone wrong. We're not giving them feedback like, graphs are all right, or some problems with graphs. The feedback says exactly what they have done wrong. Your p-value is incorrect. And the worksheet can see the reason your p-value is incorrect is because you've made this error in the calculation. So it reiterates how to do that calculation, what Excel command to use, and so on, and lets them have another go. And once they get it right, then they move on. So the next time they need to calculate that p-value, they've learned how to do it because they've just been taken through the process. So they're learning a lot more from this feedback. And the fact that they're getting it in real time rather than 4 weeks after the fact, I think really helps as well. Now, the grades they get in the quantitative skills assessment, that has trended upwards quite substantially. So this first set of bars in this sort of hideous pale green, I'm sorry, this is the distribution that we used to see, kind of an average mark somewhere in the 2-1 range, and a spread like this. And then since we brought in the Smart Worksheet, because this is our second year in the Smart Worksheet now, we've trended all the way up here, and our average is quite a bit higher. I ascribe this difference to the fact that the Smart Worksheet takes them through steps. Previously, if they got something wrong, they got it wrong. And if they get it wrong in the Smart Worksheet, they've also got it wrong. And that is marked in the same way. But previously, if they didn't do a step, they just would not do the step. Whereas now, if they try to move forward without doing a step, the worksheet tells them that they've missed something and requires them to do it. And then they pick up marks on a thing that they otherwise wouldn't have realized they needed to do. So as an example, there's a problem in there where they're comparing two sets of data, and they need to run a normality test to tell them whether they should do a t-test or Man-Whitney U. Previously, most of them would forget to do the normality test and would just crack on with a t-test. And we can give them error carried forward for the fact that they've done a t-test rather than a Man-Whitney U, which is actually what they should have done. But we can't really give error carried forward marks for skipping the normality test. In the Smart Worksheet, they have to do the normality test, and therefore they get marks for having done the normality test. So I think that is the major source of higher marks in the Smart Worksheet rather than the traditional assessment. I'm not super upset about it. One, because I don't really mind what marks they get as long as they're accurate marks, and these are accurate marks, so I don't really mind students getting a very good mark. Particularly on a quantitative assessment, you're either right or you're wrong. And if you're 95% right, then you should get 95%. That seems fine to me. The other reason that this doesn't worry me, though, is some of our other changes have not resulted in lovely, warm, fuzzy feelings. So when we introduced data analysis into the lab reports, that pulled down our marks quite substantially. And there's a couple of explanations I have for this. One is that the bar is higher for them to achieve a very good mark because we're expecting more of them in the same piece of work. And the other is we were aware that there were a lot of first-class marks being given out. Oh, laser pen. Yeah, we were aware that a lot of first-class marks were being given out. And this is the data for 23 to 24, but this had been the case for several years. And this was being looked at separately by my colleague as to why this was happening and what we could do about it. So aside from the changes to teaching and delivery that we had been making, my colleague was also introducing training for the GTAs who were marking these lab reports and focusing on getting the markers to be more consistent across the group of markers that we have. And so that has pulled down the overall number of sort of generous firsts that were being awarded separately from the teaching interventions that we made. And this is, I think, quite often a challenge in pedagogical research is so many things change at the same time, and trying to figure out exactly what has caused what outcome can be a tricky thing to unpick. But there's definitely multiple sort of input factors here into what has caused this change in marks distributions. And I'm okay with this because at the same time, the quant has gone up. So overall, student performance isn't really changing. They're doing better in some things and struggling more in others. And if they're struggling more in this, but it's a more accurate representation of their actual attainment, then that also is fine. So what we're seeing now, sort of from the various changes that we have made, is students are more confident tackling maths problems when they encounter them in labs. They're seeing the relevance of quantitative skills in their lab work, in what they do in the lab, and also in the report that they write up afterwards. They're attending workshops much more consistently than they were before. They're attaining higher marks in the quantitative assessment. We're getting what I'm going to call a more realistic measure of attainment in lab reports. And there's a couple of different contributing factors to that. And we're seeing better quality interactions between the students and the GTAs. When the students are incentivized to apply what they've learned in one context to a new context, they ask more questions. They're more willing to engage in discussion rather than sort of shut it down and I'm not going to worry about that today. I'll deal with that over the weekend. And if they're engaging better with us and asking us more questions, then they're learning more from us, which is ultimately the goal with everything that we do. So next steps, what we have planned next, because this is a cake that will never be fully baked. One thing we really need to do as a department is commit to a software package and then teach the students in that software package. So I've said that, here we go. We deliver this module in a mix of Excel and SPSS. We know that students are getting less familiar with Excel with every passing year. They're coming to us with less existing familiarity with Excel. And although we teach in Excel and SPSS, other colleagues within the department teach in all kinds of other packages, softwares, programs. It's understandably quite frustrating to students that they do a module with some SPSS and then they do a different module that's in Python and a different module that's in RStudio, and they learn just enough to be really confident in their own crapness in each of those programs. Whereas if we could teach them the same material, but all in one package, they might actually get quite good at using that package over the 3 or 4 years that they're with us. The challenge there is getting everyone to agree on what the correct package is and then moving forward from there. Another thing that we need to be thinking about is, I don't love my wording here, reading comprehension skills. That sounds like they're not reading. It's not that. It's translating a problem, a written question, into the mathematical process that they need to go through. Extracting the problem from the context is something that they are struggling with. and that I'm hearing from colleagues, students seem to be struggling with more and more sort of with each passing year. So that's the next thing that I'm thinking about, how to address that in our workshops, and not doing the convenient bypass of just telling them what the question is, but making them think a bit more about the wider context and figuring out for themselves, therefore, what question they need to be answering and then how to go about answering it. So those are my problems for the summer. That leads me to thank many people. This is, laser pointer, there we go. This is Dan Franklin, whose module I inherited and who taught me most of what I know about how to teach stats, and then was very patient in watching me unpick his module and change it for my own purposes. This is Robert Huckstep, who at the time was the Director of Undergraduate Studies and made me do it. And otherwise I wouldn't be here talking about it, so thank you to him. These are Erin Dilger, Beatriz Lagunas and Katrina Wallace, who are my sort of co-developers on this massive, scary module that we have built. And I would not have got it built without them. And thank you also massively to LearnSci, particularly Miriam, who helped, who led, I think, on building the Smart Worksheet, and Leanne, who convinced me that these things could actually be achieved.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christine. That was fantastic. Really thorough overview of some really core changes to the module that aligns with some of the strategic things that happen at Warwick. So you've managed to condense something very complicated into something very concise. So well done. I know I've got lots of questions, but I just wanted to see if anybody has any questions for Christine. If anybody has got anything, please feel free to put the hands up. So I've got one question on the chat, which is, so there's two parts. Is there a concern that any non-invigilated assessment can just be figured out using AI? I guess that's in reflection of the Smart Worksheet perhaps being utilized online. And part two, is there a way to check and or prevent AI over-reliance to replace cognitive tasks whilst maintaining student flexibility? So I don't want to focus too much on AI, but it does crop up. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I am concerned about AI. It's such a big problem, and it's one that I have really no understanding of how to fix. Yes, it worries me. It worries me very much. I hope that I'm wondering if the Smart Worksheet, it's so fiddly to plug it into Excel. No, to plug it into Copilot or something and have it go through all the steps for you. I haven't tried because I don't like to train AI on my own questions, but I would expect if I gave it a spreadsheet full of influenza data out of a GP and asked it to do a chi-square, I think it might struggle to actually show me the steps. I think it probably would output me a p-value. I don't know if it'd be a good p-value, and I don't know that it'd be able to do the steps in the way that they've been taught how to do the steps, but I don't know really, it does worry me.
I think that's what we find when we do look at the Smart Worksheets resources against the use of AI, is that when there's more complex chained calculations, it does struggle, and so it's not that as easy just to plug in and get the right answer. So I think that's something we could potentially look at that together. We could have a look at it in more detail if you want to. I wanted to just highlight something really interesting, and something that I think we do struggle with as a sector is this inflation of grades when we are actually teaching skills. And I think we really need to kind of think about the narrative around that, because from my perspective, and I've always been interested in skills development through laboratories and so on, if you teach someone a skill that's absolutely core and fundamental, I expect them to be able to do it really well. And therefore, I expect them to be highly competent in that particular skill. And so they should be scoring highly in that. So, and I see that the way that you're approaching that skills acquisition, the foundation of skills acquisition in your workshops and in the laboratories as well, is generating that culture. And so we kind of need to shift the culture around skills acquisition. But then what you're showing when you show the graphs of the labs reports, where you actually kind of got a bit more rounding of that, the results with the students, is you're showing the competencies. And so actually they're now applying that skill from the quantitative analysis into the labs, and they're still showing good competencies, but it's the is the understanding of the laboratory and the experiment and the biology and the science behind it, perhaps, which has now given them that slightly curved, the curved results. So the difference between skills, competence, and getting and being mastering a skill, and the competencies, which is then applying that knowledge and applying those skills, is something which I think could be really interesting for you to go and look at a little bit more and to have an understanding about that. So that was really, really interesting. So yeah, I really like that. That sort of stood out for me. Has anybody got anybody else in the audience right now got any questions for Christine? This is it's a massive area, quant skills, and everyone like pretty much everyone that we work with, we talk a lot about our foundational quant skills and skills acquisition. But what you've done quite nicely is tying it into curriculum, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Can I ask you a question about the workshops? So when you're doing the workshops and you have essentially introduced sort of skills passport style into those workshops, are you asking students just explain things, sort of orally explaining through things, or are you asking them to demonstrate stuff? So how are you sort of signing off the skills in your quant skills workshops?
It's a mix depending on the skill. So one of the skills is presenting a figure, or actually I think we call it constructing a figure. So within the workshop, they'll have been given however many data sets and they're working through their analysis, but there will be an opportunity to produce a box plot, for instance. And what we want them to do is not just click the box plot button in Excel and call it a box plot. We want them to think about, do they want grid lines? What should the tick marks be doing? What color scheme are they using? And is it colorblind accessible? Making intentional changes to their box plot to present it in an appropriate way. So that they will do and then show the completed figure to the GTA who's assessing them. In other skills, it is much more verbal. So we might come around and the GTA will give them a brief example of some data and a test they're going to run, and ask them to state the hypotheses for that test. So can you tell me what the null hypothesis would be and the alternative hypothesis would be? Or give them a scenario and ask them what test they should be running. And those, we make sure we've given the GTAs a good pile of examples to draw from, because obviously the students are all sitting next to each other, and we don't want them just parroting what their neighbor said. So they shuffle through a bunch of different examples, but it's all verbal.
Okay, brilliant. And I think, I think it's really interesting that we've seen innovation actually going back to being face-to-face to a certain extent, but incorporating the digital, sort of some of the heavy lifting is being done by a lot of digital resources to then free us up for the time to make our teaching more efficient and more effective. Would you say that's been one of the biggest, whilst the Smart Worksheet may have elevated the grades a little bit, would you say that that's been offset by the ability to then free up some of that work and the funding essentially that we pay DTAs to then support you elsewhere?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's really helpful having more GTAs in the room. In fact, we'd like even more GTAs, and we're getting to the point that we're running out of PhD students because the department can only support so many of those. For the size of the undergraduate cohorts, we're never going to be in a situation where we're turning GTAs away. So being able to afford to have them because we're saving money on that marking has been really helpful. Something I was just thinking about what you were saying about moving back to a sort of a face-to-face assessment. That's very un-AIable, and that's something that I really like about it. And although I wouldn't frame it this way when I'm speaking to students, because I think this is a scary word, it is drawing a little bit on what we know from Vivas. It's essentially a micro Viva. It's a 30-second Viva on hypothesis testing, and you can drill into what the student understands even in a 30 seconds or a minute when you're speaking to them in a way that you can't when they're just writing down the answer to a question, because they can articulate something without necessarily using all the correct vocabulary. And then you can clarify with them, do you mean the null hypothesis? They're calling it the not hypothesis. Do you mean the null hypothesis? Yes. And now they've learned that phrase. Whereas if everything is all written down, without that back and forth, that little bit of dialogue, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay. And do you find that creates a nice culture of talking science in the workshop with their peers?
It's yes and no. What I'm seeing is more interactions between the GTAs and the students, and more discussion amongst the students also, because they know that they overhear that someone else was assessing a thing and that they got it wrong, and then they all get together and figure out why that was the wrong answer. Sometimes the interaction between the student and the GTA can be more, the student's a little more guarded because they feel they're being assessed, and they're a little less willing to ask or to acknowledge that they're confused about something. So we're really asking a lot of the GTA because they're playing the part of teacher and assessor in the same setting at the same time. And that's something we haven't quite figured out how to handle that.
Culturally, there's an issue there, and it'd be even worse for them if it was you doing that assessment. But in some other studies that we've been working with, we find that actually other GTAs or actually students doing the assessing gets a better response from the students that are being assessed. So that's really interesting. There's a nice comment from Emily on the chat. Says, amazing talk, really well thought through and comprehensive interventions on such an important topic. Quite sad and concerning that prior experience of spreadsheet programs is decreasing year on year, but it sounds like you're setting them up really well. So do you think this is going to be something that the sector will be faced with in terms of, you know, students not being able to necessarily understand how to use Excel and those sort of spreadsheets?
First, thank you. That's a lovely comment. Yeah, I don't imagine that this is a Warwick specific problem. I know that about 7 or 8 years ago now, I think, the curriculum in British schools changed. We previously had explicitly referred to Microsoft Office as something that school children should be trained in up at least till year 9. And the specificity of that being Microsoft Office was removed a few years ago now. What that will mean is that some schools will have continued teaching Microsoft Office at least until their license sort of ran out for renewal. And then schools will one at a time be moving on to other programs instead because they're cheaper or free, or because the teacher has a particular pet love of RStudio or whatever. So I don't think it's that students are as a whole lacking some ability to handle data in some way, because that will still be on the curriculum, but the consistency of everyone being trained in Excel, that is going. That means that we need to be prepared for more diverse skill sets coming in our, particularly in big cohorts like we have here in Sciences.
I think it's a real indicator that we have to know our cohorts. It's always been something that I think has been really important to consistently sort of survey our students as they come in. The pipeline changes so dramatically. And on the chat, I think Tharin Blumenstein has disagreed that it's definitely a problem in general. And so obviously you're seeing this challenge as well. So we're just coming up to time now. So this has been fantastic. Thanks again, Christine, for a fantastic, a brilliant presentation. And I hope those of you that have been listening, or those that are listening on, if you listen to the recording of this, if you do have any questions that you'd like to raise, I'm sure Christine will be available, would be happy to be contactable, and we can pass on details if that's the situation, or contact myself. I can pass on those details as well. So that'd be fantastic.